Hi, you're tuned into Why America. I'm Leeja Miller. Let's get started. On Tuesday, the Supreme Court, in a cowardly, unsigned order giving zero explanation, ruled that Trump's ban on trans people in the military can go into effect, at least for now. This is the latest in the administration's ongoing campaign of fear and intimidation against trans people, from children to military vets and everyone in between. A tiny, marginalized group of people just trying to fucking live is being systematically targeted by a hateful regime that doesn't even feel the necessity to cloak its bigotry in the kind of pretext that characterized the first Trump administration. And yet the Supreme Court seems poised to take Trump's side. Let's talk about how the court got there and what that means going forward. In these trying times, I am all about self-care and taking time to relax. And while that means I've unplugged by turning my phone on Do Not Disturb and deleting all my social media apps, it also means sometimes plugging in, turning on, if you will. Which is why I'm thrilled to be partnering with Blesa on today's video. And my friends at Blesa and I are literally sending out free vibrators or gift cards for vibrators to everyone who signs up for my giveaway. Blesa is a woman-owned company for all things sexual wellness. We're talking toys, but also erotica, education, and more. Blesa's mission is to empower everyone to embrace, explore, and celebrate their sexuality. And I love that for me and for you. And my friends, when it comes to toys, they are innovating over there at Blesa. Check out their Luxe mini wand. It's got 5 different speeds, and the head is large and flexible, but the whole thing can fit right in your little pocket. It's rechargeable, it's waterproof. I mean, the world of possibilities this thing could open for you are endless. And speaking of endless possibilities, why not try to elevate your experience literally with the Ramp by Blesa, an angled, firm yet soft cushion that allows you to try new positions without throwing out that old back of yours. It allows for greater creativity and freedom to try new things. And it's also discreet enough to leave out. I got that acid reflux, and it's actually pretty handy if you need to be propped up for sleep. Or check out the cult classic TikTok sensation, the Rose. This is a classic. It's super soft and smooth. It's made out of silicone. It's splash proof. You're gonna love it. Or how about the Whisper Rabbit? It's got dual stimulation. It's incredibly silky soft, and it's super quiet and discreet. Have a listen for yourself. Ready? I didn't hear anything, did you? Also, waterproof and easy to clean. What more could you ever want? Blesa has all of this and so much more, so if you want to get free toys or gift cards for toys, you're in luck. Blesa and I are giving away free toys or gift cards to anyone who signs up using my link in the description. Take a moment to unwind and take care of yourself for a change at the link in the description. Something tells me you won't regret it. Thanks, Blesa. So let's start with the orders. On his first day in office, Trump issued an executive order revoking a Biden-era order that allowed trans members of the military to serve openly. A week later, on January 27th, he issued an order titled Prioritizing Military Excellence and Readiness. The order says that in order for the military to be the world's most lethal fighting force, quote, requires a singular focus on developing the requisite warrior ethos, and the pursuit of military excellence cannot be diluted to accommodate political agendas or other ideologies harmful to unit cohesion. It goes on to say, quote, recently, however, the armed forces have been afflicted with radical gender ideology to appease activists unconcerned with the requirements of military service, like physical and mental health, selflessness, and unit cohesion. Basically, the argument is that being trans is a medical condition or physical defect that requires excessive medical treatment or hospitalization, and it's also a mental health condition and interferes with a soldier's, quote, commitment to an honorable, truthful, and disciplined lifestyle. It says, quote, a man's assertion that he is a woman and his requirement that others honor this falsehood is not consistent with the humility and selflessness required of a service member. This is all, of course, complete and utter nonsense for a number of reasons. Being trans is not a mental health defect, and the mere fact of being trans does not mean that a person is inevitably undergoing extensive medical treatment such that they cannot serve. Equating the two as one and the same is overbroad and does not serve the stated purpose of ensuring military excellence, because a person can be trans and also capable of serving. And listen, I know my audience and I know I'm preaching to the choir and also a few trolls that don't actually care what I have to say, but I wanted to point those things out because it is important to note that there are incredibly strong, valid legal arguments why this trans ban on the military should not stand. Beyond your or my ethics or beliefs about the humanity of trans people and their right to exist, there are legal arguments as to why this executive order is discriminatory and unconstitutional, and the government has not given any reason why this executive order singling out trans service members specifically is necessary, especially given the standards already in place within the military to ensure that members are fit to serve. Additionally, the U.S. military has about 2.8 million members. Of them, approximately 4,000 are known to be trans. That's about 0.2% of the military population. As with all attacks against trans people, they represent such a tiny percentage of the overall population that there is no reasonable basis to find that their presence in the military plays a role in undermining the lethality of our forces or presents a threat to national security. Nor does being trans inhibit a person's ability to be committed to a, quote, honorable, truthful, and disciplined lifestyle, something that a number of cisgender current and former members of the military seem to struggle with. A study from 2023 found military service to be the single strongest predictor of violent extremism. That military experience is the single strongest individual level predictor of whether a person will commit a mass casualty event. The study found that people who served in the military are 2.41 times more likely to be classified as mass casualty offenders than individuals who did not serve in the armed forces. And I'm not saying everyone who served is violent, criminal, or extremist. I'm just saying the idea that it's the trans people in the military who struggle with committing to a, quote, honorable, truthful, and disciplined lifestyle is not backed up by the government's arguments or the stats or the data or the findings. And this is an important argument because when the government is singling out a group based on their sex, the government has to prove that the law serves an important government interest and is substantially related to achieving that interest. That standard is also known as intermediate scrutiny. Anytime a quasi-suspect class of people are singled out for their sex and treated differently under the law, the Equal Protection Clause of the Fifth Amendment requires the courts to scrutinize whether the law violates that group of people's equal protection under the laws. If the discrimination is gender-related, it requires intermediate scrutiny. Where the discrimination is based on race, it requires an even higher level of scrutiny called strict scrutiny. In cases where the law does not discriminate against an established suspect class of people, then it just gets rational basis review, meaning the government just has to show there was some basic rational basis for why they passed the law. It's an incredibly low bar, and most laws will pass that test. However, the government is arguing that trans people are suffering from gender dysphoria, which is a medical condition, and the order is written based on that medical condition, so it's not discriminating based on sex, it's based on a medical condition that will get in the way of a person's ability to serve. Therefore, because it's not discriminating based on sex, then the order just needs rational basis review, and the government says the need for national security is clearly rational, this passes muster and should go into effect. The plaintiffs obviously disagree. The named plaintiff is Emily Schilling, and there's a reason that they chose her to represent this class. She's fucking impressive. Her bio on the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics says, quote, Emily Schilling is a commander in the United States Navy. She was winged as a naval aviator in 2007, and she conducted 60 combat missions in support of operations Enduring Freedom and New Dawn in both Afghanistan and Iraq. For her actions, she was awarded 3 air medals and the Order of Data Lion's Distinguished Airmanship Award. CDR Schilling graduated with honors from Test Pilot School and received her Master of Systems Engineering from the Naval Postgraduate School in 2015. She then served as an Electronic Attack Project Officer with Test and Evaluation Squadron 2-3, where she conducted high-risk test flights in support of the U.S. Navy's most advanced air combat systems, to include the cutting-edge electromagnetic aircraft launch and recovery systems being installed in the latest generation of U.S. aircraft carriers. Following the success of this tour, she was selected as an aerospace engineering duty officer, where she is now a military deputy program manager charged with developing and acquiring our nation's next line of offensive and defensive air systems. Her major efforts as a systems engineer have included the Kepler Interplanetary Space Telescope, the next generation naval fighter, and the next generation of naval mission planning. These systems have and will push the art of the possible, offering unique challenges for systems integration, and will perhaps be her greatest technical legacy. Her story alone is proof that trans members of the military unequivocally promote the military excellence that the trans ban executive order claims to be so concerned about. As the plaintiffs argue in this case, it is clear from the language and reasoning of the order that it is solely meant to discriminate against people because of the fact that they are trans. It is meant to demean and smear a small group of people. It is driven by animus, rendering them unequal to others, a clear violation of their Fifth Amendment right to equal protection under the laws. They go on to argue that this executive order is not not discrimination based on a medical condition. It is discrimination based on sex and thus deserves heightened scrutiny, saying, quote, by forbidding military service by people who have a gender identity inconsistent with an individual's birth sex, the military discriminates against individuals like active duty respondents because they are transgender. That is the very definition of being transgender, and discrimination based on transgender status necessarily entails discrimination based on sex, as the first cannot happen without the second, which is a direct quote from a previous Supreme Court case, Bostock v. Clayton County, in which the Supreme Court found that Title VII prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity because those forms of discrimination are tantamount to discrimination on the basis of sex. The ban clearly states service members can only serve in accordance with their birth sex, and anyone who has ever attempted to transition to any sex other than their birth sex is disqualified from service. That is not based on a medical condition, that is based on sex, period. Further, the executive order is not limited solely to people who have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. The ban applies to all transgender people, not just those with a diagnosis, because it requires that all service members serve in accordance with their sex at birth and must never have attempted to transition to any other sex than their birth sex. There are no exceptions for anyone not formally diagnosed with gender dysphoria. It is targeted at all transgender people, period. That is not based on medical diagnosis, as the government contends. The government is discriminating against people because they are transgender, and their reasoning for why a transgender person cannot serve has no substantial relation to achieving their claimed interest in military excellence, as evidenced by the military excellence of trans service members. And given that the Supreme Court allowed the ban to move forward, this indicates that they likely agree with the government. Now, this was not a final ruling on the merits. It was an overturning of a temporary injunction that was temporarily blocking the order from going into effect, pending the outcome of the case against it. The Supreme Court overturned that temporary injunction and gave no reasoning for doing so in their short, unsigned order. So the trans ban will go into effect, has gone into effect, while the case plays out. And the final outcome of the case, whether it's in favor or against the trans ban, will inevitably make its way back up to the Supreme Court, where the court will get a full brief and oral argument and then make a final decision on the merits of the case. Given that the court was willing to overturn a temporary injunction against the order does not bode well for those fighting against the trans ban, because the court would only likely overturn the injunction if they believe that the government has a good chance of winning the case on the merits when it comes back up again. During Trump's first term, a similar trans ban was put in place, and the Supreme Court at that time also overturned the temporary injunction, allowing it to go into effect while the case played out in court. Trump's first term ended before the case concluded, so it was dropped, and the trans ban was reversed by Biden. But yes, please go off about how both parties are equally bad. And that first trans ban was much more limited in scope than this one. That one barred trans people from enlisting, but it allowed current service members to continue serving while receiving gender-affirming care. This new ban is against enlisting and kicks out anyone currently serving openly, cutting off their access to gender-affirming care and ordering them to voluntarily separate from the military. If they don't voluntarily leave, they will face involuntary separation that will remain on their record and could affect their ability to obtain veterans benefits. As recently reported on by Mark Joseph Stern for Slate, quote, Trump's first-term policy was cloaked in pretext, carefully crafted to avoid evincing overt contempt for trans people. His new policy, formally issued by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, does not bother with such niceties. As U.S. District Judge Anna Reyes wrote when blocking the policy, this language is soaked in animus and unabashedly demeaning, an unadulterated expression of bigotry that stigmatizes transgender persons as inherently unfit. And that judge is not the only one to have found that the EO violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Fifth Amendment. Transgender people have now been serving openly in the military for a decade, at higher rates than the cisgender population, and shown great bravery in uniform. If the problems alleged by the government existed, there would be documentation to support them. Such proof is entirely absent from the record, because there is no ounce of evidence to actually support the government's claims. Judge Settle found that even if it was not found that this was discrimination based on gender and thus subject to a higher level of scrutiny, even if this order was just required to pass rational basis review, the ban is still completely irrational and unconstitutional. And that guy's a Bush appointee. Despite these well-founded arguments, the Supreme Court seems likely to uphold the ban whenever it makes its way before them again. As reported by Vox, the Supreme Court has a long history of precedent supporting the idea that where the military is concerned, the Constitution is less controlling. The Supreme Court has held regularly that the military is owed extreme deference because it is a matter of national defense. And what do I always say? National security is always a persuasive argument for the Supreme Court. Governmental actors have gotten away with all sorts of atrocities under the guise of national security concerns. And even in peacetime, the court will offer extraordinary deference to the military military such that the bright, clear guidelines of the Constitution become blurred. For example, in the 1986 case Goldman v. Weinberger, the court found the military could ban yarmulkes while in uniform because of the need to foster, quote, instinctive obedience, unity, and commitment, which justified restrictions that would normally violate the First Amendment. And in Rostker v. Goldberg in 1981, the court held that a law that requires men but not women to register for the draft was constitutional despite discriminating based on sex, because it was discrimination done in furtherance of national defense and military affairs. And because of this history, it's highly likely that the people in Trump's orbit who are crafting these attacks against trans people know that overt discrimination in the context of the military is likely one of the easier battles to win in court, as long as they can draw even the flimsiest of lines between the discrimination and the needs of the military. There doesn't have to be, evidence to back up the line. They just need to do anything, the bare minimum, to give the Supreme Court an excuse to say, okay, but it's for the military. The military needs that. But there are other battles that trans people are fighting in court that also are an uphill climb. The case U.S. v. 𝗪𝗏𝗧𝗏 was argued before the Supreme Court in December, and the court has yet to issue a decision. That case is related to Tennessee's Senate Bill 1, which prohibits medical treatments intended to allow a minor to identify with or live as a purported identity inconsistent with the minor's sex, or to treat purported discomfort or distress from a discordance between the minor's sex and asserted identity. This is limited to hormone therapies like HRT and puberty blockers and does not pertain to surgical procedures for trans youth. Petitioners in that case, like the trans military ban case, argue that this is a violation of their guaranteed equal protection under the laws. Unlike the military trans ban, there is no national security argument available for the government here. They also have Supreme Court precedent on their side in Bostock v. Clayton County, which I mentioned before. In that case, in 2020, the court ruled 6-3, finding it is impossible to discriminate against a person for being homosexual or transgender without discriminating against that individual based on sex. The Supreme Court will likely issue the decision on U.S. v. 𝗪𝗏𝗧𝗏 next month, and the final decision will have widespread implications for trans youth care across the country. If the court decides that it is not discriminatory to ban trans youth from receiving hormone therapy, that will open the floodgates of states that have already attempted to pass those bans. It could also create the precedent necessary to allow for further discrimination against trans people writ large, not just trans youth. If the court agrees that discriminating against someone for being trans is not sex discrimination. The decision has not been released yet, but a lot can be inferred based on how the justices behave during oral arguments. The questions they ask, their hostility towards one side or the other, it can all give an indication of where they're at in the deliberation process. Analysts indicated on the day the oral arguments were heard back in December that it does not look good for the transgender plaintiffs in this case. The justices seemed interested in creating some sort of carve-out so that discrimination against trans people for medical reasons wouldn't count as sex discrimination. And this is concerning for women generally because there are all sorts of procedures that cis women get too that could then be targeted if all of a sudden it's open season for sex-based discrimination so long as there's a medical reason for it. Like, the vibe was so bad for the trans plaintiffs that at one point Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson said, "I'm getting kind of nervous that some of the justices seemed eager to chip away at bedrock anti-discrimination principles." As Vox reported on the day of the oral arguments, quote, "The biggest question in 𝗪𝗏𝗧𝗏, in other words, is likely to be how the court finds a way to uphold Tennessee's law rather than whether the court does so. And it seems fairly likely that the court's opinion could fundamentally alter the rules governing sex discrimination by the government." Again, that decision will come down likely next month, and the trans military ban is now in effect even as that case continues to wind its way through the lower courts, so it's unclear when the Supreme Court will get another chance to rule on that case. A similar ban on gender-affirming care for trans youth, issued as an executive order on January 28th, is also facing legal challenges and has been temporarily paused pending the outcome of that case. That order would deny federal funds for providers of gender-affirming care for people under 19, and that case is also still ongoing. And across the pond, the UK's top court ruled last month that the legal definition of woman is someone biologically born a woman, as J.K. Rowling TERFs everywhere cheered. This means that now women-only spaces can discriminate against trans women. Trans women will be sent to male prisons, and intersex people, I guess, do not exist. How will people trying to enforce these biological women-only spaces determine who is trans and who is not? Forced strip searches, perhaps? I don't know. It's just so fucking stupid. Like, in my legal opinion, as a trained attorney, this shit is stupid. It is stupid policy based on bigotry, backed up by literally zero evidence that any biological woman has ever faced danger from a trans woman ever. There's zero evidence that the US military is worse off because of trans service members. And on the other side, there is ample evidence that the trans members of the military serve to improve the military, that violence against trans people increases when laws are passed discriminating against them, that gender-affirming care literally saves teen lives and adult lives. But bigotry and hatred don't need facts or evidence to exist. And now the basest impulses of the worst members of our society are being upheld by the highest legal authorities in the country. To help, check out organizations in your area that support trans rights, or donate to the Trans Youth Emergency Project from the Campaign for Southern Equality, linked below. Listen to the stories of your trans friends and community, support trans youth, and support trans art. I got to see Jasmine 4T open for Lucy Dacus on Monday, and Jasmine genuinely stole the show. Her song Guy Fawkes Tesco Dissociation is a fucking bop. Support trans art. All my videos are completely ad-free and uncensored over on Patreon, patreon.com/LeejaMiller if you'd like to join. Thank you to my multi-platinum patrons, Mark, Thomas Orff, Sarah Shelby, Art, David, RH, Latranger Lucas, Joshua Cole, Thomas Johnson, and Tay. Your generosity makes this channel what it is, so thank you. And if you like this episode, you like the one from Monday about Trump's attacks on local officials. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.